We have reached part 3 of the original 6 celebration, and we will finally be moving into the United States of America as well. If you are new here, allow me to introduce you to the series. I am covering the history of each one of the original 6 NHL teams, seeing as they are all at least 100 years old now. If you haven't seen the first 2 videos on the Montreal Canadiens and Toronto Maple Leafs, I highly recommend you do, although it is not necessary to watch these videos in order.
Today, we will cover the first American franchise in NHL history, one with a rich history of success at the highest level and players so famous that even non-hockey fans might be familiar with the name. Today, I will be covering the Boston Bruins. So, without further ado, let's jump into it.
The Boston Bruins were founded all the way back in 1924, so a few years after the original formation of the NHL. Boston grocery magnate Charles Adams convinced the NHL to expand into the United States. Adams had begun to enjoy hockey after watching the 1924 Stanley Cup Finals between the Montreal Canadiens and the Calgary Tigers. Thus, he wanted his own hockey team. Fortunately for him, the year before, Thomas Duggan had given him an option for an NHL team, and on October 13, 1924, Charles Adams paid $15,000 to the NHL to receive an expansion team in Boston. They would become the first American team in the league and joined the Montreal Maroons as expansion teams for the year.
Upon the formation of the franchise, Adams hired Art Ross, a former star hockey player, to become the general manager of the team. Ross would be with the team for the next 30 years, and he also coached the team 4 different times. So, yeah, the Bruins really couldn't let go of this guy. Either way, Ross was tasked by Adams to come up with a team name. Adams wanted the name to display a wild animal, one with speed, agility, and cunning that would provoke fear in opposing teams. The idea of Browns came up, but was not ever chosen, which I think was a good decision. Ross came up with the ideas of Bruins, which, if you did not know, is a name used for brown bears in classic folk tales. The colors also went along with the Bruins' original colors of brown and yellow, which would eventually change to black and yellow. The colors were not taken because of the name, though, as the colors were directly from Adams' grocery chain, First National Stores.
The Boston Bruins would play their first game on December 1st, 1924. It was also the first game in the U.S. for the NHL. The Bruins won 2-1 against the Maroons in Boston Arena, with forward Smokey Harris scoring the first goal in Bruins history. Unfortunately for the Bruins, this was probably the most joyful part of the whole season, as they finished the year with a 6-24 record and a .200 points percentage. On the bright side, the points percentage would be the worst in history, meaning it was only up from here. The only other noteworthy thing of the Bruins' inaugural season would be that their rivalry with the Montreal Canadiens began in a 4-3 loss at home on December 8th, 1924. Things would start trending up, as I said, as while the Bruins missed the playoffs in 1925-26, their record would improve to 17-15-4. Then, in year 3, the Bruins would finally make the playoffs, despite a worse record. Art Ross had acquired many Western Hockey League, or WHL, stars, like the great defenseman Eddie Shore, which helped the team in the long run. In the Bruins' first playoff run, they went deep, making it all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals. Unfortunately, the Bruins lost to the Ottawa Senators in the finals. However, something happened in that cup-winning game that I honestly don't know how to describe without stating exactly what happened. Bruins player Billy Cotu attacked a ref in the game, which earned him the NHL's only ever lifetime ban. It's always Boston up to some shenanigans. It doesn't end after this. There are more instances of the Bruins doing some questionable things, yet this is the one with the most importance, I would say.
Moving forward, the Bruins would move arenas in 1928-29 from Boston Arena to Boston Garden. However, with that said, Boston Arena actually still exists today, as Northwestern University uses it, now named Matthews Arena. That makes it the oldest ice hockey venue in use at a competitive level and the only surviving arena that an original 6-team arena used to begin their tenure in the NHL. But the move to Boston Garden seemed to grant the Bruins luck, as they won the 1929 Stanley Cup over the New York Rangers. The Bruins had many star players then, like the aforementioned Eddie Shore. With him were Aubrey Dick Clapper, Harry Oliver, Dutch Gaynor, and goaltender Cecil Tiny Thompson.
The Bruins have been an insane force in the regular season virtually since their inception, seeing as they won 38 of 44 games for an NHL best .875 points percentage in the 1929-30 season. That record still stands, and so do other Bruins records, but we will get there, as always. In general, though, the 1930s Bruins were a force, leading the league in the standings 5 times during the decade, and consisting of players like Shore, Clapper, and Thompson, but also Babe Seaver and Cooney Wheeland.
One other standout player during this time period would be rookie goalie Frank Brimsek in 1939, whom the Bruins traded for, losing Thompson in the process. That meant he had some big shoes to fill, and he did just that and more, really. He won the Calder Trophy and was the first rookie to ever be named to the NHL First All-Star Team. Not only that, the Bruins won the 1939 Stanley Cup, their second in franchise history. This Bruins team was just stacked, with the previously mentioned stars and also players like sudden death Mel Hill and Bill Cowley. On top of that, the Kraut line of Milt Schmidt, Bobby Bauer, and Woody Dumart helped the Bruins even more during the finals.
2 years later, in 1941, the Bruins won their third Stanley Cup, which would be their last for 29 years. A large reason for this could be the fact that World War II massively affected the Bruins, as in more than most teams. Players like Brimsek and the players on the Kraut line would head to the war after the 1941 championship, meaning the Bruins would lose some of their best players for multiple years. With that, the Bruins' early years came to a close as they entered a new era. Yes, the original Six era, named that for the fact that the league stayed at 6 teams for the entire period. It may not have been the most number of teams in a season for the NHL, but for the first time, the league had found some stability, as no teams would fold during this era. However, focusing on the Bruins, in 1944, Herb Kane set an NHL record for points in a season with 82, which may or not have been a fluke season. More importantly, Dick Clapper led the Bruins back to the Stanley Cup Finals that same season, doubling as a player and a coach. The Bruins did not win, and Clapper retired as a player the next season, which made him the first player to ever play 20 full NHL seasons. Quite the accomplishment, I must say. Moving forward, we have another instance of Boston antics, as in 1948, forward Don Gallagher was suspended for life based on the suspicion that he was gambling on his team to lose. Only in Boston. Anyway, with the war ending, the Kraut line returned, and playing well, while Brimsek unfortunately lost his form, leading him to be traded to the Chicago Blackhawks.
The Bruins would finally find their iconic look in 1948-49, or at least a variation of it. The logo, dubbed the Spoked B, had a small number 24 on the left of the B to represent 1924, the Bruins' inaugural season. On the right, we have a 49 for the 1948-49 season. The logo was also a nod to Boston's nickname, the Hub. The logo was then modified the next season, removing the numbers in a version that was basically used until 1993-94. That's a long time, but it shows how historic the logo was. Even after it was changed, it was still the same idea of the Spoked B.
As the Bruins moved into the 1950s, new ownership would overtake them, with team president Weston Adams, Charles' son, accepting a buyout offer for the team from Walter A. Brown, who owned the Boston Celtics, a team in the NBA, if you weren't aware. He also owned Boston Garden, where the Bruins played, which probably helped in his acquisition of the team.
Another fun fact about the Bruins in this era was the fact that they were the first known NHL team to own a Zamboni. On New Year's Day of 1954, Robert Schrack demonstrated the Model E Zamboni to the Bruins management at Boston Garden. Schrack was the assistant to Frank Zamboni, the creator of, the Zamboni. Now, this historic Zamboni can be found in the Hockey Hall of Fame in Toronto, where it has been since 1988. One more important moment in Bruins history is when left winger Willie O'Ree played his first game on January 18, 1958. Why is this so historic? Well, that is because O'Ree was the first black player in NHL history to play a game. O'Ree did not play much in the league, only playing 45 games across the 1957-58 and 1960-61 seasons, but he scored 6 goals and tallied 10 assists, which is more than most people can say.
Overall, this was not a very successful period for the Bruins. While they made the Stanley Cup Finals in 1953, 1957, and 1958, they lost to their arch nemesis in the Montreal Canadiens every single time. From 1947 to 1967, the Bruins only had 4 winning seasons, and they missed the playoffs for 8 consecutive years from 1960 to 1967. A lot of blame can be put on the lack of a developed farm system for the Bruins. At the end of the day, all that mattered was the Bruins were bad. However, a savior would soon grace the roster. More than one savior, at that.
To talk about this era, we have to go back a bit. Back in 1964, Walter A. Brown passed away, allowing Weston Adams to repurchase the team. One of Weston Adams' most important moves, possibly his most important move, was signing Bobby Orr, a defenseman from Parry Sound, Ontario. Bobby Orr is widely considered the greatest defenseman of all time, and some even consider him the greatest player of all time. He won the Calder Memorial Trophy for the best rookie in the league in 1966-67, and was immediately named to the second NHL All-Star team, showing his pure talent even as a rookie. Unfortunately, despite Orr's dominance as a young gun, the Bruins still managed to miss the playoffs. However, things would get better the very next season, as in a trade with Chicago, the Bruins would obtain 3 young forwards in Ken Hodge, Fred Stanfield, and Phil Esposito. The latter of the 3 would become the NHL's top goal scorer and be the first player ever to break the 100-point mark in an NHL season. With those 3 players added to the roster, the Bruins would make the playoffs, the first of many consecutive appearances. By that, I mean the first of 29 straight appearances. That's a lot. The reason? Well, with Esposito and Orr, along with other stars like forwards Johnny Busick, John McKenzie, Derek Sanderson, and Hodge, defensemen like Dallas Smith, and goaltender Gary Cheevers, the Bruins would obviously be a top team. They were called the Big Bad Bruins by many fans around the league. In 1970, the Bruins would do it. And by it, I mean break their 29-year Stanley Cup drought, of course. The Bruins swept the St. Louis Blues in the finals to hoist Lord Stanley yet again. In Game 4, Bobby Orr scored the cup-winning goal in what is one of the most iconic goals of all time, even warranting a statue of it in front of the Bruins arena. Orr scored the goal and went flying in the air right after it. This was also the season where Orr won his third consecutive James Norris Memorial Trophy, of 8 consecutive wins, by the way, the Art Ross Trophy, the Hart Memorial Trophy, and the Conn Smythe Trophy, making him the only NHL player ever to win 4 major awards in the same season.
The 1970-71 season was insane in Boston, as they had 7 players in the top 10 in league scoring, which had not occurred before and has not occurred since. On top of that, the team set the record for wins in the season, which they would do later again, and had 4 players with over 100 points. The 4, being Orr, Esposito, Hodge, and Busick, were all named first-team NHL All-Stars, which was a feat only matched by the 1976-77 Canadiens. Ultimately, though, the Bruins lost to the Canadiens and rookie goalie Ken Dryden in 7 games in the playoffs, after choking a 5-1 lead and losing 7-5 in Game 2. The Bruins would not think much of the disappointing year, though, as they won the Stanley Cup in 1972 over the New York Rangers in 6 games. The next few seasons for the Bruins would not go as well as 1970 and 1972, though. Starting in 1972-73, many changes happened to the Bruins franchise. Many players left the team for the World Hockey Association, or the WHA, like Jerry Cheevers, John McKenzie, and Derek Sanderson. On top of that, the Adams family sold the team to Storer Broadcasting. With that said, the Bruins were obviously still a competitive team, and they made the 1974 finals versus the Philadelphia Flyers. But they did lose, so they were still on the decline. The 1974-75 season would be the final full one for Bobby Orr, as many knee injuries kept him out of the lineup. He would retire in 1979, ending his tenure on the Chicago Blackhawks after agent Alan Eagleson turned down a 5-year, $925,000 offer, or 18.6% ownership of the Bruins in 1980. Around the same time, Phil Esposito was traded with Carol Vadnais for Jean Rattel, Brad Park, and Joe Zanuzzi from the Rangers. Obviously, Bruins fans weren't stoked to lose their star, but it ended up working out, as Rattel and Park worked great in Boston while Esposito wasn't stellar in New York. This was probably head coach Don Cherry's idea, as he and Esposito didn't necessarily see eye to eye when it came to coaching. The Bruins had a few more finals appearances, once in 1977 when they made it there after Cheevers returned from the WHA. They got swept by Montreal. Oh well. In 1978, the team had 11 players with 20-plus goals, which is still an NHL record. They lost to a Canadian team with the best regular season record in NHL history, again in the finals. Montreal kind of owned Boston at this time.
Here's one more fun story for this era. On December 23rd, 1979, a game where the Bruins beat the Rangers 4-3 in the iconic Madison Square Garden, John Captain, who was a Rangers fan from New Jersey, because the New Jersey Devils did not exist yet, took Bruin player Stan Jonathan's stick and hit it with him in a post-game scrum. After that, everything exploded. More fans got involved, fellow Bruin Terry O'Reilly got involved, and another Bruin and defenseman Mike Milbury pulled off Captain's shoe and hit him with it, in a fight called Milbury and the Shoe. The aftermath of the incident led to multiple suspensions, with O'Reilly being suspended 8 games and McNabb and Milbury being suspended 6. I mean, the whole team, besides goalie Cheevers, received a $500 fine. And Captain? He was sentenced to 6 months in prison. The moral of the story is to not hit people with sticks, and also everything crazy in the NHL happened in Boston.
With that said, it's time to move on, into a new era of Bruins hockey, from one generational defenseman to the next. Let's dive into the Ray Bourque era.
Ray Bourque is one of the greatest defensemen of all time, and he would play for the Bruins for over 2 decades. But first, how did the Bruins acquire him? Well, in 1979, a trade between the Bruins and the Los Angeles Kings occurred that sent Rob Graham to LA and a first-round pick to Boston. That pick would end up being the 8th overall selection, so bad idea by the Kings to trade it, especially since it became Ray Bourque, who was drafted by the Bruins with said pick.
Continuing the playoff streak, the Bruins made the playoffs every year in the 1980s, with Bourque of course leading the way. With him, and the help of players like Cam Neely and Keith Crowder, the Bruins made it to the Stanley Cup Finals in 1988. They would be swept by the Edmonton Oilers, but don't get mistaken, this series was still iconic. That was because in Game 4, or what was supposed to be Game 4, with the game tied 3-3 in the second period, the lights would go out in Boston Garden due to a blown fuse. Subsequently, the game was cancelled and the series shifted back to Edmonton at Northlands Coliseum. That game was originally supposed to be Game 5, but of course, it ended up being Game 4. Anyway, the Bruins would lose 6-3, but the real story for the Bruins is how that light malfunction caused them to begin work on a new arena. Bourque and company returned to the finals in 1990, yet again facing the Edmonton Oilers. I'm sure the team was yearning for revenge. Unfortunately, they got clobbered again. But this time it was in 5 games, so there was some progression, I suppose.
Before we jump forward some more, I would like to point out that the Bruins-Canadiens rivalry was very one-sided at the time. Montreal had a 57-year-long playoff winning streak against the Bruins, one that started in 1930 and lasted until 1987. That is because it ended in the 1987-88 season. After that, the Bruins would build their own streak, beating the Canadiens in the 1990, 1991, 1992, and 1994 playoffs. That pales to the Canadiens' 18-year consecutive playoff series victories against Boston from 1946 to 1987, but beggars can't be choosers. In 1995, Boston Garden would see its final season of use with the Bruins. Unfortunately, the final official game played there was a 3-0 playoff loss to the New Jersey Devils during the 1995 Stanley Cup playoffs. However, an exhibition game against the Canadiens was played on September 28, 1995. In that game, the Bruins, coincidentally, won 3-0, with Cam Neely scoring the final Bruins goal at the arena. The Bruins would move into the Fleet Center, which is now known today as TD Garden.
In 1997, the Bruins, for the first time in 29 years, missed the postseason. That set a record for the most consecutive playoff appearances in the history of a North American professional sports team. While the Bruins would make the playoffs a few seasons after this disappointing year, the results would remain quite futile. Just like the couple of previous seasons before 1997, the Bruins would be unable to make it any further than round 2. These playoff woes started in the 1992-93 season and would not end until 2011, which was a very special season. We will get there, though. In the 1999-2000 NHL season, GM Harry Sinden realized that, unfortunately, the Bruins weren't really going anywhere in terms of success. They had stayed stagnant, being consistently unable to perform in the playoffs. Therefore, Sinden made a decision, which was to trade Ray Bourque. Sinden knew Bourque was one of the greatest defensemen in history, and yet he didn't have his name on the Stanley Cup at the time. Sinden wanted Bourque to have an opportunity to win the Cup, and that opportunity would not come with Boston. So he traded Bourque, along with another veteran named Dave Andreychuk, to the Colorado Avalanche for Brian Rolston, Martin Grenier, Samuel Pallone, and a first-round pick, which ended up being 27th overall in 2000, being used to draft Martin Samuelsson. In 2001, Bourque did it. He had won the Stanley Cup in his 22nd and final NHL season. Truly a poetic ending.
So, the Ray Bourque era ended in a cup for Bourque, just not the Bruins along with him. Either way, the Bruins would enter into a short period of struggle after Bourque's departure from the team.
The Bruins missed the 1999-2000 postseason, finishing last in the Northeast Division. That didn't make the season any less eventful, as on February 21, 2000, Bruins forward Marty McSorley hit Vancouver Canucks forward Donald Brashear in the head with his stick, garnering an ejection and a suspension for the rest of the season. But wait, there's more. On October 6, 2000, he was convicted of assault with a weapon on Brashear, ending with a sentence of 18 months on probation. Thus, the suspension was lengthened until February 21, 2001, a full year after the initial incident. It's always Boston, isn't it?
The Bruins barely missed the 2000-2001 playoffs, but after that, they would begin to make the playoffs frequently. They even won the Northeast Division for the first time since 1993 in 2001-02. This is due to their strong core of guys like Mike Knuble, Bill Guerin, Sergei Samsonov, Brian Rolston, Glenn Murray, and Joe Thornton. Thornton is probably the most notable player here, as he is a Hall of Famer. Well, if you've heard his name, it's probably not because of his time in Boston. Thornton spent most of his NHL career with the San Jose Sharks, a team he joined after the Bruins decided to trade him at the end of November in 2005-06. In return, the Bruins received Marco Sturm, who is actually the current Bruins coach, Brad Stewart, and Wayne Primo. The Bruins would regret that trade pretty much immediately, as Jumbo Joe went on to win the Art Ross and Hart trophies that same season despite playing with two teams.
The Bruins ultimately missed the playoffs in 2005-2006, ending an era where the Bruins struggled compared to the previous 3 decades. They made some playoff appearances, but they never made a deep run because overall the team was never super dominant. The Bruins would not long be marred with struggles, though, as soon enough, the Bruins would make their presence known around the NHL.
In 2006, a new GM took over the franchise in Peter Chiarelli. At the time, Mike Sullivan was fired as head coach, which doesn't add any impact to what transpired next. I just thought it was interesting that Sullivan was the Bruins head coach at a time in history. Either way, Dave Lewis was named the next coach, and Chiarelli went on to sign cornerstone defenseman Zdeno Chara from the Ottawa Senators. Chara was, at this point, one of the most coveted defensemen in the NHL, and would only improve his resume in Boston. They also signed Marc Savard, which isn't as important. The Bruins sucked in the 2006-2007 season, which led Lewis to be fired and replaced by Claude Julien, which is pretty rough. Firing your coach after one season is definitely a bold move, but it shows how the culture in Boston was successful. At the same time, the Bruins revealed a new logo, being a modernized spoked B. They also introduced a new shoulder patch logo that was based on the team's logo used on the jersey until 1932.
In 2008, the Bruins made it back to the playoffs with a 41, 29, and 12 record, facing the rival Canadiens in round 1. They actually forced the Canadiens into a 7-game series. The most memorable moment was in Game 6, when the Bruins came back to win 5-4. Was that game pointless? Kind of, because they lost Game 7, 5-0. But at the same time, the series rekindled interest in the Boston Bruins franchise in the New England area, where teams like the NBA's Boston Celtics, MLB's Boston Red Sox, and NFL's New England Patriots had long overshadowed Boston's own hockey team. This was because those teams won championships, which the Bruins had not done in decades. However, the Bruins would soon win a cup, as young players Patrice Bergeron and David Krejci showed immense promise, along with Milan Lucic, Vladimir Sobotka, and Petteri Nokelainen. In the 2009 offseason, unfortunately, Phil Kessel was traded to the Toronto Maple Leafs due to their inability to meet Kessel's contract demands and the looming offer sheet from the Maple Leafs GM, Brian Burke. Not a good start for the Bruins. However, later that 2009-10 season, the Bruins played the Philadelphia Flyers at Fenway Park in Boston on January 1st, 2010 in the 2010 NHL Winter Classic. They won that game 2-1, making them the first home team to win the annual Winter Classic since the event began. The Bruins really struggled after that, with losses piling up. However, after a 3-0 win in Montreal, the Bruins began to stabilize, partly due to goalie Tuukka Rask, who broke out and became the Bruins starter going into the Olympics break and after the season. In the 2010 playoffs, after a 6-game series win over the Buffalo Sabres in round 1, the Bruins blew a 3-0 series lead to the Flyers, where they lost in Game 7 on May 4th, 2010. That made them the third team in NHL history to blow such a lead. Sure, they were injured, but the defeat was embarrassing. Brutal, even. However, Bruins fans wouldn't dwell on it too long.
The 2011 season came and went, with the Bruins led by a promising group of players including Chara, Bergeron, Krejci, Lucic, Brad Marchand, and the newly drafted Tyler Seguin. They also acquired Chris Kelly and Thomas Kaberle at the NHL trade deadline to bolster the team. The 2011 Stanley Cup playoffs rolled around, with the Bruins facing rival Canadiens in round 1, whom they defeated in 7 games. After that, the Bees defeated the Flyers in 4 games to advance to their first Eastern Conference Finals since 1992. Once there, the Bruins faced off against the Tampa Bay Lightning. They emerged victorious, winning the series in 7 games, advancing to the Stanley Cup Finals for the first time since 1990. Once there, they met with the President's Trophy winning Vancouver Canucks. The first 2 games of the Stanley Cup Finals were close, but ultimately, the Bruins found themselves in a 2-0 hole, losing Game 1 1-0 when Raffi Torres scored with 19 seconds left in regulation and Game 2 3-2 in overtime. Heading back to Boston, the Bruins needed to rebound. Luckily, that's exactly what they did, winning Game 3 8-1 despite an injury to Nathan Horton in the first period. Then, in Game 4, the Bruins won in a 4-0 shutout of the Canucks. That meant the series was tied heading back to Vancouver. The Canucks won Game 5, 1-0 in the third shutout of the series on June 10th. This meant the Bruins had to win Game 6 to keep their season alive. Fortunately, they had the advantage of being at home. I say this because, well, being at home always helps teams, but also the home team had won every game of the series up to that point. So, on June 13th, the Bruins captured Game 6, 5-2, sending the series to one final game. The best 2 words in sports, Game 7. And, wouldn't you know, the home team wouldn't win. The Bruins marched into Vancouver and took a 4-0 win, with 2 goals coming from both Patrice Bergeron and Brad Marchand. The Bruins won their 6th Stanley Cup in franchise history and their first in 39 years. Well, Canucks fans rioted in the streets, because, of course they did. Also, of course Boston was indirectly the cause of mayhem, because that always happens. Goalie Tim Thomas won the Conn Smythe for playoff MVP. The Bruins would once again make the Stanley Cup Finals in 2013, after a 2011-12 season where they lost in round 1 to the Washington Capitals in 7 games. The run started with a series against the Maple Leafs. While the Bruins led the series 3-1, the Maple Leafs would tie the series and lead 4-1 in Game 7. If you watched the Toronto episode, you know how this ended, but the Bruins tied the game off with goals from Nathan Horton, Milan Lucic, and Patrice Bergeron. Then, Patrice Bergeron won the game in overtime for the team to send them to round 2, where they beat the Rangers in 5 games. Then, after sweeping the Penguins in the Eastern Conference Finals, they met the Chicago Blackhawks. Unfortunately, they lost in 6 games to that Blackhawks dynasty. It was a very emotional series, as New England had been rocked by tragedies that year, with the Boston Marathon bombing and Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting. The Bruins wanted to win the Stanley Cup to unite New England through the rough times. While the Bruins didn't win, they sure gave a valiant effort.
The next season in 2013-14, the Bruins won the New Atlantic Division with a 54-19-9 record and 117 points. This also netted the team the President's Trophy. The Bruins could have easily made another deep run, but they didn't. After a round 1 win over the Detroit Red Wings, the Bruins lost in round 2 to the Montreal Canadiens in 7 games, who have had the Bruins' number forever. Then, the rough patch hit. In 2014-15, the Bruins had a pretty good record of 41-27-14 for 96 points. However, the Penguins and Senators took the final two playoff spots, leaving the Bruins out, making them the third team in NHL history to miss the playoffs after winning the President's Trophy the year before. They were also the team with the most points in history to miss the playoffs. Not exactly a fun record to own. That led to the firing of Peter Chiarelli and a new age of the Bruins. However, winning a cup under Peter Chiarelli had to have made the era a success. I mean, it was the Beast's first cup in 39 years.
After Chiarelli's firing on April 15, 2015, former Bruins player Don Sweeney was hired on May 20th to be the next general manager of the franchise. In the 2015-16 season, Sweeney's first as general manager, the Bruins achieved their 3,000th win on January 8, 2016, in a 4-1 win at the New Jersey Devils. This is an accomplishment only shared with the Canadiens at the time. Despite this, the team struggled in the final 2 months of the season, and ultimately missed the playoffs for the second consecutive season, the first time that had happened since 2005-06 and 2006-07.
As the years went on, more changes happened in Boston. First, Claude Julien was replaced with Bruce Cassidy with 2 months remaining in the 2016-17 season. That year, the Bruins did make the playoffs, but lost in round 1 to the Ottawa Senators. The next season, the Bruins had a 50-20-12 record under Cassidy, finally becoming a powerhouse again. After beating the Maple Leafs in round 1, though, they lost to the Lightning in round 2.
Alright, now we're at an important season. Not to say the others weren't, yet this season was very important. The Bruins finished the season with a respectable 49-24-9 record. In round 1, they faced the Maple Leafs. The Bruins had a habit of doing that. They also had a habit of beating the Maple Leafs in 7, which they did again. Moving forward, the Bruins would defeat the Columbus Blue Jackets in round 2 in 6 games to make the Eastern Conference Finals for the first time since 2013, which, in comparison to some earlier droughts we discussed, doesn't sound that bad. The Bruins would push further, though, after sweeping the Carolina Hurricanes to move to the Stanley Cup Finals for the third time in the 2010s, further cementing the fact that the Bruins were a dominant force in the league yet again. The Bruins would face the St. Louis Blues in what would be a rematch of the 1970 Stanley Cup Finals, although this time the outcome was the exact opposite. Instead of a sweep by Boston, the Blues won in 7 games to win their first Stanley Cup in franchise history. A painful end for the Bruins season, yet there was still lots of hope for the future. The next few seasons felt like rinse and repeat year after year. The Bruins had a great regular season, yet they could not get far in the playoffs. The Bruins won their second President's Trophy in a decade span in 2019-20, and superstar David Pastrnak shared the Maurice Rocket Richard Trophy with Alexander Ovechkin of the Capitals for most goals in the league. With 48 goals, Pastrnak was the first Bruin to ever win the award. However, after a 4-1 series win over the Hurricanes in round 1, the Bruins lost to the Lightning in 5 games in round 2.
In the 2020-21 season, the Bruins yet again won in round 1, this time over the Capitals in 5, but lost to the New York Islanders in round 2 and 6. In 2021-22, the Bruins lost in round 1 against the Hurricanes in 7, a loss that cost Cassidy his job. He was replaced with Jim Montgomery.
However, things felt different in 2022-23. The Bruins were yet again a great regular season team. In fact, they were the best regular season team of all time. They set countless records, like the longest home winning streak to start a season from October 15th to December 3rd with 14 wins. The Bruins then became the fastest team in NHL history to record 100 points in their 61st game on March 2nd, 2023. Then, on March 11th, they became the fastest team in NHL history to 50 wins in just 64 games. The Bruins became the third fastest team to clinch a playoff berth in the 82-game era of the NHL. Then, the biggest records were broken. On April 9th, 2023, the Bruins won their 63rd game of the season over the Flyers to set a new record. And on April 11th, the team set the record for most points in this season with 133 in a clash with the Capitals. The Bruins finished that season with 65 wins and 135 points.
Entering the playoffs, everyone thought the Bruins would easily dismantle the Florida Panthers in round 1. And they looked to be right, as they held a 3-1 series lead over them. However, the Bruins choked that lead and lost the series in 7 games off an overtime series winner from Carter Verhaeghe that I witnessed with my own 2 eyes. It was insane to see that the greatest team of all time fall to a wildcard team, and the implications surrounding the series needed their own video one day. After that, Bergeron and Krejci retired, assuring that the next season would be very different. The Bruins celebrated their centennial season in the 2023-24 season, and they were very good, making the playoffs, where they would face the Maple Leafs again in round 1. They would lead the series 3-1, but choke it and enter a decisive Game 7, likely seeing demons from the previous year. However, Pastrnak scored the series winner in overtime for a 2-1 Bruins win. They wound up losing to the Panthers in 6 games in round 2, who have had the Bruins' number since that insane 2023 series.
Last year, the Bruins sucked. After trading goalie Linus Ullmark, the Bruins had a holdout with their other goalie, Jeremy Swayman, for a contract. It got resolved, but it must have left some bad juju, as the Bruins finished bottom of the division and traded many key players, including captain Brad Marchand, to the Panthers, no less. That is how you know it's bad. Their official centennial game was on December 1st, 2024, which was 100 years since their first ever game. The team wore special jerseys in a 6-3 win over the Canadiens. They also had special jerseys in 2023-24. The Bruins may need a few more years of retooling, but they have a somewhat bright future. They already have many stars, with players like forward David Pastrnak, defenseman Charlie McAvoy, and goaltender Jeremy Swayman. On top of that, they have some decent young players like Fraser Minton and Mason Lohrei, as well as prospect James Higgins. If he can be a legit number one center, the Bruins will be scary in a few years. Who knows? Maybe they will even win another Stanley Cup.
The Bruins have an extremely rich history of Hall of Fame players and incredible teams. However, even some of those teams have been unable to win when it matters most. Obviously, the Bruins are a pretty successful franchise overall, making many Stanley Cup Finals appearances, and winning 6 of those as well. They have been the franchise of consistency, including 29 consecutive playoff appearances at one point. Obviously, the Bruins have had moments that they would prefer to forget about, but when the spotlight is always on you, you're bound to mess up sometimes. If you're going to leave this video with anything, leave it with this. When teams like the Bruins are so successful for so long, they are obviously held to a higher standard than most teams. That can make it seem like a failed season when the team does not at least make the finals. However, there are many other ways to measure success than if your team won a championship or not, like the players that have gone through your organization. So, don't let the Bruins' failures stand out from this video, because the successes should always outweigh the failures. Oh, and also, leave this video knowing that Boston is absolutely crazy. That's important too.